Hello students and welcome to today's lecture. So we will be starting with D.H.Lawrence's novel Sons and Lovers. In this discussion, we will be looking at Lawrence, the history of publication of Sons and Lovers. We'll be looking at this through a few letters that D.H.Lawrence has sent to his correspondents. And we will also be studying some autobiographical elements of Sons and Lovers, and we will also be looking at Sons and Lovers as a bildungsroman. And after that, we will, if we do have time, we will be looking at a few important extracts and analyze them in line with our predominant thematic concerns, which we identify in this novel, right? So to start off with, we have to identify that there are autobiographical elements in Sons and Lovers. So you can even call Sons and Lovers an autobiographical novel, but it would be better if you can simply identify that it is a novel with autobiographical elements. So what does that mean? That means that it involves the life and personal experiences of the writer D.H. Lawrence himself, which are woven into this fictional narrative that he has written, Sons and Lovers, right? So the autobiographical elements of this narrative is predominantly evident when it comes to the setting of this novel, because it mirrors D.H. Lawrence's own childhood in the Midland coal mining village of Eastwood. And throughout the novel, we see that the experience of D.H. Lawrence and Paul Morrell, his protagonist in Sons and Lovers, intersects in a number of times. And we will be looking at these throughout our discussions based on this novel as well. So as I said earlier, we'll be looking at a few letters that Lawrence has sent to his correspondents, and we will be analyzing them in line of the history of publication of this novel, Sons and Lovers, right? So this is an excerpt. Before we go to this, actually, we have to identify that D.H. Lawrence's Sons and Lovers, which was published in 1930, it studies family, class, and his early sexual relationships. And it draws heavily from his own personal experiences, which is the reason why we identify that this is a novel which has autobiographical elements, right? So if you look at the history of publication of Lawrence's Sons and Lovers, we identify that Lawrence began working on the first 4 drafts of what would become his 3rd novel, Sons and Lovers, in the period of his mother's final illness before her death in December 1910. So we see that even this has been incorporated in the narrative, Paul Morrell's mother's death and how he coped up with it, right? So we are given that in this narration as well, which is also taken from an actual real-life experience of Lawrence and incorporated into this novel. So Lawrence's view at this time of his, and we also, another thing which we see in this narrative is this relationship, marital relationship between Gertrude Morrell and Walter Morrell, right? So Lawrence's view at this time of his own parents, of his own actual parents' marriage, can actually be gained from this letter he wrote 3 days before his mother died. So this was also at the point when he started writing on the first version of Sons and Lovers, right? So when we read this novel, we see that Lawrence's parents' relationship actually mirrored that of Walter and Gertrude Morrell in his narrative, Sons and Lovers, right? So Lawrence writes that in reference to his actual mother, "My mother was a clever, ironical, delicately molded woman of good burgher descent. She married below her. My father was dark, ruddy, with a fine laugh. He is a coal miner. He was one of the sanguine temperament, warm, hearty. but unstable. He lacked principle, as my mother would have said. He deceived and lied to her. She despised him. He drank. Their marriage life has been one carnal, bloody fight. I was born hating my father as early as ever I can remember. I shivered with horror when he touched me. He was very bad before I was born. This has been a kind of bond between me and my mother. We have loved each other almost with a husband and wife love, as well as filial and maternal. We knew each other by instinct. We have been like one, so sensitive to each other that we never needed words. It has been rather terrible and has made me, in some respects, abnormal. I think this peculiar fusion of souls, don't think me highfalutin, never comes twice in a lifetime. It doesn't seem natural. When it comes, it seems to distribute one's consciousness far abroad from oneself, and one understands. I think no one has got understanding except through love. Now my mother is nearly dead, and I don't know how I am. So Lawrence here, we can understand that it's like what is very evident here is that Lawrence's love towards his own mother, right? So the love for the mother at once gives closeness and mutual understanding, and this understanding produces love, right? So here we can see an account which is given by Lawrence of his own take of his mother's relationship and his hatred over his father, and due to his father's abusive behavior, due to the domestic abuse which his mother was which his mother experienced as a result of this relationship between his mother and father, right? So you see that these perfectly mirror the feelings of Gertrude and Paul both, which we can see in this narrative. And another thing that we can notice about this mother-son relationship in terms of in terms of Lawrence and his own mother's relationship, it is quite unique, right? So it is very unique in terms of the kind of love that he says they share, because he says that it is almost with a husband and wife love, as well as filial and maternal. So to a certain extent, we can understand that there are a few unconventional elements between this mother and the son's love, right? But at the same time, we cannot say that it is incestuous, right? Because he says that it is filial and maternal. And it is these elements that have been incorporated in terms of exploring the dynamics of the relationship between the mother and the son, between Gertrude and Paul Morel in his own narrative, Sons and Lovers, right? And we will be discussing this more when we continue on our discussion of this novel. So as I said earlier, we will also be looking at the publication history of this book, Sons and Lovers, right? So the earliest never completed draft of the novel is actually now lost, but a plan exists in one of Lawrence's college notebooks, which suggests that he distanced the narrative from what had occurred in life. So in his fantasy figure, which he never published, the very first draft of this novel, apparently the father figure dies, right? And he did not use close family members. So the story of his dead elder brother Ernst, whose life later provided the material for the story of William Morel in Sons and Lovers, has not been included in that first draft. And he neither develops characters drawn straight from his main early lovers, such as Jessie Chambers and Louis Burroughs. And actually, Louis Burroughs was still his fiancé at the time when he was writing the first draft of the novel. And the direct cause of Lawrence breaking away from writing his first version seems to have been grief at his mother's death. He did not return to the novel for 3 months, and in the second version of Paul Morel, to use Lawrence's working title for what would become Sons and Lovers, Lawrence continued to produce a highly fictionalized reworking of autobiographical material using his own experiences in the figure of Paul. A large section of this manuscript survives, including the death of his father after he has killed an eldest son, a character who actually does not find his way into the later versions in a domestic dispute. And Paul's early relationship with Miriam proceeds along the similar lines to the finished text, but she is actually lifted into the middle class, right? So it's again very different than the actual final version of the novel. And in terms of his family life and his early experiences of love, there was a very close relationship between the two, right? And Lawrence showed parts of his second version to Jesse Chambers, who was his first lovers and the basis of the character Miriam in Sons and Lovers. And it was part of a strategy over the coming years to submit the work of people who had either known him or who had complete detachment from his earlier years, in order for Lawrence to kind of gauge their responses and I guess to improve his further drafts of the novels as well, right? So she felt strongly that Lawrence's mother had been a major impediment in the relationship between herself and Lawrence. So that is what Jesse Chambers felt like. And as I said earlier, Jesse Chambers has been his basis for the creation of the fictional character Miriam in Sons and Lovers, right? So Jesse Chambers felt that the mother has been like this impediment in their developing relationship. And she actually wanted it reflected in this novel. And that is something Lawrence has actually interwoven to the final version of his narrative, right? And Jesse Chambers gave further advices to Lawrence to improving the drafts of this novel, such as to include the material such as the life of Lawrence's dead brother Ernst in the guise of Walter's death in Sons and Lovers, right? And that is something he actually excluded in the first draft, but comes across in the final draft of the novel. So Lawrence did his third and penultimate draft of the novel, and the writing of this version was in the late 1911 and the early 1912. It coincided with one of the very remarkable changes in the course of his life, because Lawrence fell seriously ill with pneumonia and nearly died. And by that time, he had, after recuperating after that, he returned to his hometown in Eastwood, in Nottinghamshire, having resolved to try and earn his living by pen. And he resigned his teaching jobs. His teaching job ended his engagement to a woman called Lucy Burroughs, and planned to spend time in Germany. His writing had put him in touch with leading figures in the London literary world, and particularly important was his relationship with Edward Garnett, right, who was the literary advisor to the publication firm in Duckworth. And this meant that Lawrence, and also apart from that, Lawrence asked his old professor at Nottinghamshire University College, Ernst Weekly, for his advice about teaching assistantships in German universities, invited to Sunday lunch, but finding that the professor was not there when he arrived. Lawrence started talking with Weekly's wife, Frida, and after a brief acquaintance, Frida was to go to the continent with Lawrence, and in time to decide to leave her husband and children more permanently. After divorcing Weekly, she married Lawrence in 1914, right? And Frida gave Lawrence an awareness about developments of German-speaking intellectual world that was important for the novel, just as Jesse Chambers' advice was sticking close to life. So according to Frida's account of their first meeting, she and Lawrence talked about the effects of early childhood on later life, about the Oedipus. And within 20, actually this happened within 20 minutes of their first meeting as well. So Frida, if we look at Frida's history, that is also important because she had been involved in an affair with Otto Grass, who was an early disciple of Sigmund Freud, right? So she was in a position to give Lawrence access to the interpretive model for the events addressed in the novel. In particular, that his early love for his mother had continued for too long and stifled in early relationships. So it is not only then that Sons and Lovers can be interpreted psychoanalytically, as one reviewer even claimed very early during the 1915, right? So this relationship that he had with Frida's experience with being exposed to Otto Gross, who is an early disciple of Freud, can be a reason why this novel is predominantly analyzed by incorporating psychoanalytic criticism, right? So that was the importance of his development of the novel through Frida's intervention, right? So when Lawrence sent this novel for publication, one of the publishing houses which rejected this novel was the house Heinemann. So William Heinemann himself rejected Lawrence's novel on the grounds that it would offend circulating liberties. Heinemann personally had feelings of repulsion, commenting that the degradation of the mother character, which is supposed to be of gentler birth, is actually almost inconceivable. So Lawrence, therefore, decided to draft the novel again one more time, and that is the final time, and to work through the text, the new understandings that he had gained. And it was this last version that he actually incorporated the thematic title of his novel called Sons and Lovers. So earlier the title was Paul Morel, and he replaced that with the title Sons and Lovers, right? So the final version which Lawrence wrote is actually not a schematic interpretation of events of his new models. The strong bond with his mother was actually depicted positively in this final version. And after finishing this final work, he also wanted to write a defense of this work, where he identified this narrative as a coherent work of art, right? So he wrote this in a letter to Edward Garnett, who published this novel. So this is what Lawrence said. He said, I tell you, it means the novel here, has got form. Haven't I made it patiently out of the sweat as well as blood? It follows this idea. A woman of character and refinement goes into the lower class and has no satisfaction in her own life. She has had a passion for her husband, so the children are born of passion and have leaps of vitality. But as her sons grow up, she selects them as lovers. First the eldest, then the second. These sons are urged into life by their reciprocal love of their mother, urged on and on. But when they come to manhood, they can't love, because their mother is the strongest power in their lives and holds them. As soon as the young men come into contact with women, there's a split. William gives his sex to a fribble, and his mother holds his soul. But the split kills him because he doesn't know where he is. The next son gets a woman who fights for his soul, fights his mother. The son loves the mother. All the sons hate and are jealous of the father. The battle goes on between the mother and the girl, and the son as object. The mother gradually proves stronger because of the tie of blood. The son decides to leave his soul in his mother's hands, and like his eldest brother, go for passion. He gets passion. Then the split begins to tell again. But almost unconsciously, the mother realizes what is the matter and begins to die. The son casts off his mistress, attend to his mother dying. He is left in the end naked of everything, with the drift towards death. It is a greatest tragedy. And I tell you, I've written a great book. It's the tragedy of thousands of young men in England. Now tell me if I haven't worked out my theme like life, but always my theme. Read my novel. It's a great novel. If you can't see the development, which is slow like growth, I can, right? So this is Lawrence's own justification of his own novel in terms of what takes place in the novel, the tensions that the protagonist has in terms of his love towards his mother and his love towards the other women in his life, such as Miriam and as well as Clara, right? Clara later on have been encapsulated in this, right? So Miriam's spiritual love, Clara's passionate love, and how they conflict in terms of his very deep and profound love towards his own mother is something that he deals with throughout this narrative, right? And then finally coming to the mother's death and how he copes up with it. So according to Lawrence, this is like a very coherent work of art, and that is how he sees it, right? And then there is one more section that I want to read. That is actually from the Introduction to Sons and Lovers by Dr. Howard J. Booth. And this is also like, it is from Dr. Howard J. Booth's article that I drew this information on the biographical details and the history of the publication of Sons and Lovers as well. So he says that, so far, I hope to have presented, so this is Dr. Howard J. Booth. He says, so far, I hope to have presented an account of the novel's development as a history of shifting understandings of early experience, which find their way into the final version. The reader, this suggests, has to think about the understanding or understandings of events in play at the place in the text, and to ask how they are being led to accept one view rather than another. So this is very important. This is in terms of what Booth identifies in the narrative. So when he says the first part of this particular section I have quoted about presenting an account of the novel's development as a history of shifting understanding of early experiences, which find their way into the final version, that he's talking about in terms of discussing the writing of the journey of Lawrence, his publication journey from the beginning till his final publication. And what is important here is that Booth is saying that we have to incorporate that as a reader to our understanding of the events and the incidents and circumstances which are at play in the narrative, right? Where Lawrence kinds of writes all these events and incidents in a way that we are led to accept one perspective or one point of view rather than another. So that means the priority by Lawrence is given to one point of view or one perspective, and that is given more importance rather than another narrative point of view, right? So we'll be looking at how Lawrence achieves this by analyzing certain key extracts from the text. However, before we do that, we have to identify Sons and Lovers as a bildungsroman. What is a bildungsroman? The bildungsroman emerges during the 19th century and continues up until actually now, right? Its focus is on the conflict between the alienated individual and the cultural forces. So cultural forces meaning family, the neighborhood, class, religion, and ethical milieu against which the individual seeks to establish himself. And the Bildungsroman, which can be described as a novel of self-development or apprenticeship novel, are the best English equivalents. It features a protagonist who is an apprentice to life, whose goal is to master it so that he can achieve an ideal or ambition, fulfillment of which will heighten his sense of self. So here in this narrative, we see Paul, the protagonist, struggle to free his soul from his mother and to become an artist, and how he's conflicted due to economic necessities. And Paul's movement towards self-realization is actually expressed symbolically in this narrative, in his rejection of his adjustment to everyday life, which is something which his siblings such as Arthur and Annie do, right? And a Bildungsroman often fictionalizes his author growing up. So therefore, it has characteristics of the confessional genre of writing, as well as the autobiography. And we know that Lawrence has taken autobiographical elements of his own life and incorporated it into the life of his narrative, right? And it says that a Bildungsroman, in the journey of the protagonist of a Bildungsroman, we see that life is internalized, right? So that means that the experiences and adventures of Paul in Sons and Lovers are important to Paul's psychological development or his sense of self. And the Bildungsroman protagonist is usually passive, reflective, intellectual, and artistic. And therefore, it is also, it is a character which has been fashioned by the writer himself, right? And in terms of the choices of the central character, so here in this case, the choices of Paul in this particular Bildungsroman are based on vocation, mating, religion, and identity. So vocation is in terms of the economic situation, and religion is related to the spiritual or religious growth or development of the character, that is, the character of a protagonist, Paul here. And identity is basically the development of selfhood or the sense of self, right? However, when it comes to mating, it is important because mating plays a very significant role in the maturation process or the psychological development of the protagonist. So as I said earlier, in a Bildungsroman, what is very important is in terms of how the protagonist achieves his psychological development, how the protagonist achieves his maturation process. So the way, when we talk about the way in which he achieves his maturation process, mating plays a very important role. So in terms of achieving his psychological development or maturation process, and this is, of course, when we are talking about mating, it is something which is inevitable that the protagonist will inevitably use and exploit several members of the opposite sex. Because, as you know, in Bildungsroman, it has a tendency to adopt the protagonist's point of view for the purposes of maximizing for the reader the central figure's sense of self-concern, which means the part played by the opposite sex is actually instrumental rather than performing an independent function of its own. So an independent, so basically the primary function of these opposite sex characters is to contribute to the growth of the protagonist and not really to be preoccupied, and therefore the writer is not really preoccupied with the feelings of those opposite sex characters who might be exploited in the process, of achieving the protagonist's sense of self, the protagonist's sense of maturation, his psychological development. So this has also been, there have also been criticisms against this in terms of how Paul would exploit his opposite sex characters in terms of, for the purposes of achieving his self-realization. So this criticism is taken from Richard D. Beard's Sons and Lovers as a Bildungsroman. Kate Millett in Sexual Politics, she says that, writing from a Marxist perspective, Millett accuses Paul, and by implication Lawrence himself, of using three women in his life, then discarding them when they no longer serve his self-centered interests. Millett describes Paul as the perfection of self-sustaining ego and states the women in the book exist in Paul's orbit and cater to his needs. Clara to awaken him sexually, Miriam to worship his talent in the role of disciple, and Mrs. Morrell to provide always that enormous and expansive support. So we can understand that in a feminist perspective, according to feminist criticism, this has been criticized. Lawrence attempts to use all these opposite sex characters, such as his mother, Miriam, and Clara, in terms of how they contribute to his development and end up hurt and taken advantage in the process. So Kate Millett is critical about it. But what Lawrence is also doing is basically achieving the development of his protagonist. So though we can actually be critical of Lawrence's objective, we also have to understand that what he's trying to do is using these characters to achieve the self-realization or maturation process of his protagonist, which of course plays a very important role in the making process of a Bildungsroman narrative. And this is the place where we will be stopping our first lecture, and in our next lecture, we will be particularly focusing about this particular section, where I mentioned how in D.H.Lawrence's Sons and Lovers, he attempts to kind of prioritize one narrative perspective over another. So we'll be particularly looking at that by analyzing key extracts in the novel. And that is the place where I will stop my first lecture. Thank you very much for listening.